So recall from our previous lecture that we created a dog class, and within that dog class we created a method called bark that printed out to the screen the dog barking. And we were able to call that method from our main method so that we didn't have to use the full system.out.println to create the bark. Now we're going to learn how to pass in parameters to create more complex behaviors that we couldn't do before with a simple method. Let's get into it. So recall this from our last lesson. We created the dog class, we had our main method, and within our main method, we called the bark method, and that bark method printed to the screen. Now here we printed the bark method twice. We used it twice. But if with my dry coding principle, I want to write as little code as possible in order to accomplish my task. So say, for example, that I want to call bark maybe 5 times within my code. Instead of calling bark 5 times, I might want to write another method that simply prints to the screen as many times as I want. So let's go ahead and accomplish that task. Now we're going to accomplish this with a concept called overloading. And recall we used overloading previously with a method substring where we have the same name for a method, but new parameters. So we want new parameters. So these new parameters give us new ways to manipulate the code and new things to do. So let's take a look at overloading, excuse me, our bark method. So in order to overload our bark method, we're going to need to create a very similar header. Everything in the beginning part of the header of our method is going to be the same. The only thing that's going to change for us is the parameters between the parentheses. So let's go ahead and write that. We're going to write public. I'm going to go ahead and move this up so I can write a little bit neater. Public static void. And we're going to call this method bark just as we did before. And now we're going to create our parameter list. So inside the parentheses go our parameter list. Now, when you're creating the method header, you need to define what parameters you are putting in and what data types those parameters are. In this case, we're going to start with primitive data types, but we can put in classes and all kinds of different things in there. The order matters. So the order matters when calling. It doesn't matter in terms of if you want to put doubles first or classes first, but each parameter creates its own list, or each ordering of parameters, I should say, creates its own unique signature for that method. So if you put a double first, then an integer, that is a different method than if you put an integer and a double, and when you call that method, it has to be in the same order. We'll show this in just a minute. So I'm going to put one parameter. I'm going to put a parameter integer, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a descriptive name. I'm going to call this numBarks. Integer numBarks will be a local variable. The scope of this variable will only be through the curly braces. This is an important concept to understand. Just like when we created our integer variable in our for loop that was only available during the curly braces, this is only available inside the method. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that, only available in the method. Within the method. Okay, so we have our numBarks. Now let's say we want to print out to the screen I'm going to go ahead and write it right here. I want a capital B, bark. Okay, and now I'm going to want to loop through as many times as I have barks to print out this system.out.println. So I'm going to use a simple for loop, and I'm going to say for my int, we'll call it x since I is a little too close to our semicolon to be usable, int x equals 0. And as long as x is less than our numbarks, and we're going to say x plus plus. Okay, so now whenever a person calls our barks method and puts an integer in the parentheses, it's now going to call this method. It's going to overload our original bark method. It's going to call this method, and this method will use the numbarks, and that will then print out bark as many times as we want. So if we go back up here, if we change one of these methods, let's go ahead and get rid of this one. So instead of writing bark twice, I instead write bark with a 2 here. It now calls my second method with an integer barks. And remember, when we're calling a method, we don't have to put the definition of what that data type is. Java will figure out what the data type is and then replace that and then use that within and pass the value in. Pass in the value 2. This will loop through twice. So let's walk through this really quick. In our main method, we call bark, we pass the value 2. The number 2 comes in here. Numbarks is now 2, right? From main. So this comes from main. Now we loop through and we check and we run this as though it's any other for loop, checking that numbarks, or x is less than numbarks, which in this case is 2. Since we're starting at 0 and we're using a regular less than, we're going to run this loop twice and we're going to print bark to the screen twice. Now, when we get to the end of here, numbarks is garbage collected. So numbarks is garbage collected now, which means that we don't have access to this numbarks back in our main method. So as soon as we finish this piece of code here and we jump back out of it and we go to the next line, we don't have access to numbarks. It's only available within that method. We're going to learn how to violate this a little bit when we get to working with classes in methods, but when we're working with primitive data types, skipping over that there, when we work with primitive data types, we have there's no way to re-access that information. So any information we put in here, we cannot access later. And remember, this too can be a variable, it can be anything else within our code as long as it evaluates to an integer within that method. Okay, in the next lesson, we will talk a little bit more about using classes and how that differs from using primitive data types. I'll see you guys in the next lesson.